Hello, and welcome to this Cochrane webinar on updating meta-analyses as part of a series intended for Cochrane statistical editors. To introduce myself, I'm Dr. Mark Simmons. I'm a research fellow at the University of York, and I'm a specialist in meta-analysis and its methodology, and particularly in looking at the field of how we update meta-analyses and maintain robust updated meta-analyses over time. And of course, I'm also a convener of the Cochrane Statistical Methods Group. So let's think first about the issues around why we need to update reviews at all. Well, obviously it's perhaps a sometimes slightly overlooked and forgotten aspect of Cochrane. When Cochrane was set up, part of its intention was to keep systematic reviews updated and continuously ongoing so that evidence would be up to date and relevant in all fields. That perhaps has got a little bit lost over time. So we need to think about how and when we should update a systematic review and a meta-analysis. That might, of course, be as soon as a new study emerges. As soon as we realise that a new study is relevant for the meta-analysis, either through formal searching, database searching, or because we've just become aware of it through our own knowledge, then we might want to update as soon as that happens. Whenever a new study arises, we'll extract its data and put it through a meta-analysis. Of course, that might be somewhat burdensome. If we've got a lot of small studies, for example, they're not realistically going to change the results very much of our meta-analysis. So perhaps we might want to think about, when is our meta-analysis likely to have some change in conclusions, however we might interpret that. And perhaps we should wait until we've got enough evidence from new trials, like one very large trial, for example, before we start updating our meta-analysis. Because, of course, updating is a time-consuming process. It takes a lot of work, and that costs a lot. We have to do all the searching and screening and risk of bias assessment and data extraction and so on. It's a lot of work, and we cannot spend our entire lives just trying to update a single systematic review. So we have to have some kind of prioritizing. And that also means you have to be able to think about when can we stop updating our meta-analysis? When is it reasonable to say this review is not going to change, it's not worth considering this any further? And also, which meta-analyses, which reviews should we prioritize for updating? Which are the ones that really need the work now? Perhaps the ones where, we know the field is changing rapidly, new trials are coming along fast, and we need to update the evidence. Perhaps that might include reviews that haven't been updated for a while, and have perhaps got left behind a bit. And of course, we have to think about this, as I've said already, really, that we know that the conclusions and the evidence will change over time. And if we're not summarizing that evidence and keeping it up to date, then of course our review is wrong and the meta-analysis and its results are meaningless. So we have to keep things updated. Just to clarify, of course, there are lots of grounds for why we might choose to update or not update a systematic review. For example, a treatment might go out of date and be superseded by more modern treatments, or, people may just stop researching in this area, so it's not worth trying to hunt down research that is never going to be there. But I'm going to focus obviously on in this session purely on the statistical issues around updating and how and why and when we update and how we conclude things from updated meta-analyses. So there's a lot of other issues, more practical clinical issues in updating that I'm not going to really discuss today. So what are the key problems that we have to face when we're trying to update a meta-analysis? Well, the first thing, of course, is that a meta-analysis is not like a clinical trial. We have no control over when the studies arrive, when the studies are published. Even a study that's actually performed and completed might take a long time before it actually reaches publication. We have no control over the size of the studies either, so we have no control over how much evidence accumulates over time. And of course, the really big problem perhaps is the heterogeneity. We simply have no control over the studies, their protocols, their participants, how they've used a treatment or an intervention and so on. And of course that might be so there'll be heterogeneity across those studies which we have no way of controlling or influencing. And of course we have plenty of ways of handling that in a conventional one-off meta-analysis. But how do we handle it when we're updating a meta-analysis, knowing that our heterogeneity might change over time as, people change how they use a treatment over time? So that represents sort of a major problem in how we deal with updated meta-analyses. So throughout this session, I'm going to illustrate sort of my ideas here with a set of meta-analyses extracted from the Cochrane database. In this case, I've just trawled through Cochrane and I've pulled out all the reviews I could find that had at least 3 trials in them, so that it was worth doing a meta-analysis in, and had at least 1 update so far. That amounted to 469 reviews, and I've just taken the first listed, the primary meta-analysis from each of them. So I've got a sample set here of 469 meta-analyses to work with. And here's a little bit of a summary of what those meta-analyses looked like. About 2/3 of them were binary outcome meta-analyses, dichotomous outcome meta-analyses, and about 1/3 were continuous outcome analyses. I've excluded things like survival analyses, diagnostic reviews, and other more unusual outcomes for the sake of simplicity for this example. Only about 1/3 of those meta-analyses were conventionally statistically significant. I had a p-value of less than 0.05 at their most recent update, so about 2/3 were not significant. So generally speaking, most meta-analyses do not produce a significant result. As you're probably well aware, most meta-analyses in Cochrane are rather small with very few trials. The median was only 5 trials, and more than 10 trials was somewhat rare, though we did have one bold meta-analysis with a whole 283 trials in it. And effect sizes tend to be quite small. Here the effect size here is either a log odds ratio for binary outcomes or a standardized mean difference for continuous outcomes. So these are not necessarily analysed as exactly how the original meta-analysis would have done it, because we're only using log odds ratios or standardized mean differences. But you can see the typical effect size is quite small at only 0.16, and even the statistically significant results, meta-analyses only had effect sizes on average of 0.61, so only just over half a standard deviation on the standardized mean difference scale, which is not particularly large. So we're not getting huge, really impressive treatment effects anywhere particularly. If we think about the heterogeneity, so recording the I-squared, about half of all meta-analyses had an I-squared of 0, so no detectable heterogeneity at all. And only a very tiny minority, only just over 5%, had an I-squared of over 90%, which would start to suggest, heterogeneity of substantial concern or real impact that might be, leading to us saying that, these trials are very different. Obviously, I should point out the classic caution here that I-squared, of course, is not a measure of heterogeneity, but a measure of the ratio of heterogeneity to total variance, so kind of the influence or importance of heterogeneity in a meta-analysis, not the true heterogeneity. So that means that if we look at the statistically significant meta-analyses, interestingly, their I-squared on average is much higher. They have a median I-squared of 50%, whereas those with no statistically significant result had an I-squared of 0. So generally speaking, interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, statistically significant meta-analyses have more heterogeneity in them, have higher I-squared, to be precise, than the non-significant ones. That may be because they generally have high heterogeneity, but it may also be because those probably have the larger trials. And larger trials means smaller variance, and that tends to mean larger I-squared. So just some note of caution, it may be high heterogeneity, it may be just that the trials are bigger. So just for the next few slides, I'm going to think about how, if we just did, how the things change over time, if we just did a meta-analysis of every single new study, we just update the meta-analysis in turn, what happens to our results as we go through the sequence of trials across the total meta-analysis. So here's an example. This is looking at the summary treatment effect, and how, if we updated the meta-analysis at every study, how that would change over time. So here I've just truncated this at 50 studies because obviously there are very few meta-analyses with more than 50. And I've also highlighted the red are the meta-analyses which are ultimately not significant, and the green are the meta-analyses that are ultimately significant. Not surprisingly, obviously the green meta-analyses have bigger treatment effects generally than the red. But the main thing to take away here is that you can see that the lines for each meta-analysis, for each updated meta-analysis become horizontal quite quickly, which means that after about 10 or 15 studies, the treatment effect really isn't changing at all. So the treatment effect is quite robust in a meta-analysis. Once you've got a reasonable set of evidence, maybe 10 trials or so, a reasonable sample size, then your treatment effect really isn't going to change very much after that. It's very difficult to change the summary treatment effect once you've got a reasonable amount of data. There's one sort of obvious counterexample to that in this plot. This sort of, if you can see at the very top, that green line that sort of wanders to very, very high treatment effects, about just under 5. So an example where, something is going on in that meta-analysis where we're really seeing very big changes in treatment effects over time. But generally speaking, treatment effect is fairly robust over time. And also we can see here that treatment effect, there's a sort of funnel shape, so the treatment effect is clearly decreasing quite rapidly in the first 5 to 10 trials before it starts to stabilize. So early trials generally have more extreme treatment effects than later trials. That would be suggesting that. So let's have a look at, I'm going to truncate now the same plot, but now only looking at the first 10 trials. Obviously, of course, remembering that the median number of trials in any Cochrane meta-analysis is only 5, so this, of course, is representing how far most Cochrane meta-analyses will get, typically. So you can see here that we're seeing that same sort of flattening out, even after 5 studies or so, treatment effects are not changing very much over time. But there is, again, that definite sort of slight funnel shape. Treatment effects do decline quite rapidly in the first 3 or 4 or 5 studies before they start to stabilize. And almost all treatment effects are heading towards the null. So, our early estimate treatment effect is probably an overestimate effect. Let's quickly look at the standard error. Obviously, standard error is slightly less interesting because obviously as more information accumulates, we naturally expect the standard error to decrease quite rapidly over time. Notice that I've used a log scale here for standard error because of the very wide differences in standard errors that we can get in reviews. But as we can see, obviously, generally speaking, as we'd expect, standard error decreases quite rapidly. Occasionally, as you can see, there are occasional upward jumps in standard error where a heterogeneous trial will suddenly make the confidence interval wider, the standard error larger. But it's not actually all that common and doesn't make massive differences, generally speaking, to the standard error. So standard errors confidence intervals do narrow substantially over time. But I'll sort of focus now on the more interesting examples, and so let's look at the p-values over time for meta-analyses. So here's the p-values for over the first 50 studies. And if we just focus here on sort of the studies with the meta-analyses with more studies, with more than 10 or more than 20, you can see that even if we've got quite a lot of studies, a lot of evidence on a meta-analysis, the p-values are jumping around quite a lot. There are plenty of trials where the p-value will still, even after 10 trials, will jump all over the place. Although those that are going to be statistically significant, ultimately, the green set, they are sort of trending downwards and, they hit significance and they tend to stay there. There's sort of one exception. If you look at around study 30 to 40, you can see that there's there's an example there where one study zooms up from being significant, having a p-value around about 0.05. P-value goes up to 0.25 over about 5 studies and then comes back down again at around study 40 to be significant again under p of 0.05. So we can get some bounce in p-values. But the more interesting area really is p-values up to the 10th study. And here I just want to highlight, obviously, that look at this is clearly a mess. And really the idea here is just to see what a mess it is. That, knowing what your p-value is after 5 studies tells you nothing really about what the p-value will be after the 6th or the 7th study. It could go from very low to very high or very high to very low. So really your significance p-values are really not very useful at all if we're going to accept that we're going to update our meta-analyses over time. We really cannot tell what's going to happen at the next update in terms of statistical significance. You should probably stress here, of course, that there are plenty of green meta-analyses that are ultimately significant that are not significant at all in the first 5 to 10 studies, and there are even a few red lines that drop right down under the dotted line of p 0.05. So there are some meta-analyses that are ultimately not significant but do produce a significant result somewhere along the way, normally early on, as you can see in the first sort of 5-6 studies. So we have to be cautious. That sort of suggests that p-values are really not very useful at all if we're going to start thinking about updating of reviews rather than just one-off reviews. Let's have another look at the I-squared and the heterogeneity. I think a sort of similar pattern here. Once you get past sort of 10 studies, I-squared sort of starts to stabilize, although it can jump around a little bit. But it's sort of I-squares jumping of 10 to 15%, you can see there is quite common. So I-squared, again, is not particularly stable, even after quite a lot of studies. You can see this at the bottom right there, there's an example where the I-squared was 0 for quite a long time, and then suddenly at about study 44, it zooms up to an I-squared of 25%. So even quite late on, we might get a heterogeneous trial, which radically changes our view of the heterogeneity. But again, I think let's focus on the first 10 trials. And I think here, the key idea here is that, again, our knowledge of I-squared, our knowledge of heterogeneity in the first 10 trials is completely variable. You can see, I think, if you look sort of deep into that plot, there are some meta-analyses where the I-squared goes from 0 to 100 to nearly 100% in a single update, and some where it goes from very high heterogeneity to very low heterogeneity in a single update. So it can jump all over the place, really. Heterogeneity is very unpredictable. I-squared is very unpredictable over the first 3 to 10 studies, as you can see from just the complete coverage of the field here. So again, any interpretation we make of I-squared or of heterogeneity, after 5 studies, at the next update it might be completely different. So if we look at the actual heterogeneity variance in terms of the formal, the tau squared, the true variance rather than the I-squared, we see an interesting pattern here that actually I have to admit I didn't realise until I did this plot, about how dramatically heterogeneity declines in the first sort of 5 to 10 to 15 studies. You can see there's most meta-analyses start off with quite a high heterogeneity estimate, and that heterogeneity estimate sort of plunges down quite fast as you accumulate evidence. And increasing heterogeneity is not that common. As you can see, there's only a few meta-analyses here where the heterogeneity goes up later on. So it's interesting that heterogeneity does decline quite rapidly on average as we go through meta-analyses. And again, we'll just show that for the first 10 studies. Obviously, it's a bit more messy in the first 10 studies. Heterogeneity can go up and vary quite a lot. There's a few where the heterogeneity jumps around quite a lot here. But the general trend, even in the first 10 studies, is sort of downwards. So we briefly talked, when we looked at the p-values, about, that some meta-analyses that are ultimately not significant do have a significant result in an early update. And so just sort of looking at how many that is, so how many non-significant MAs with a p-value of above 0.05 with the final analysis, the most recent analysis, have an update where the p-value is less than 0.05 at some previous update. And actually it's around about 12 to 13% of those. So most meta-analyses never have a significant result. They're always non-significant. But there are a few that have at least one, and a smaller proportion that have 2 updates with a significant result. Very few with any more than that. But so it's important to realise that kind of the true significance, the true p-value, as we update meta-analyses, is not 5% at all. It's actually much higher. It's sort of at least 10%. So we've got to be careful there that, the classic 5% cutoff is not really valid when we're updating meta-analyses. Sort of the converse to that is, for those results that are statistically significant at their most recent update, how long does it take before we hit statistical significance? So that's what this sort of plot here shows, the percentage of the studies before we hit statistical significance for the first time. As you can see, there's quite a big chunk that take 100% that, they don't reach significance until the most recent update. But there's also quite a lot that, the statistical significance is reached at about a quarter or a third or a half of the studies in total. And so that's sort of indicating a potential for research waste. Are we updating meta-analyses long before, continuing to do studies and updating reviews long before they're really needed? We're wasting half of our evidence or more than half of our evidence here. So we've got this balance between, we shouldn't jump to conclusions too fast, but again, we need to avoid research waste and taking too long. So just to summarize what we've seen so far, when we update a meta-analysis, the treatment effect estimates tend to converge fairly quickly to where they will ultimately go. Once you've got a few studies, 5 to 10 studies in a meta-analysis, the treatment effect estimate is pretty robust. But we also should note it does tend to head towards the null. So from the first few studies, it's likely that the treatment effect will actually go down and towards the null over time. But p-values and statistical significance are wildly inconsistent over time. They're really not a good way of assessing the future path or the future strength of the evidence. So obviously I'm sure we're all well aware of the many, many problems with p-values. I think this just highlights that they're even more problematic when we're trying to update reviews. And so there is type 1 and type 2 errors, as I'll come back to those in more detail later, as a big problem. We've got a big problem with, overconfidence that some reviews will produce significant results when they shouldn't, and underconfidence that we may be carrying on reviews for too long. And I-squared and heterogeneity are also very inconsistent, particularly early on. And so understanding heterogeneity is very difficult early in an update with very few trials. And heterogeneity, interestingly, tends to decline over time. That's probably because, early trials are often industry sponsored, created by the intervention manufacturer and so on. They have a strong incentive to try and show the treatment works, so they'll focus trials in populations or with doses where the treatment is most likely to work. But as you go later and later, as the drug develops, other people take it on, they do different things, and so not surprisingly perhaps, the treatment effect declines a bit, and also the heterogeneity declines a bit because it's the first few trials that are the most extreme and unusual and different from each other. And as you said, time progresses, perhaps trials get a bit more consistent. So these are all sort of things to bear in mind that we can see as we update meta-analyses. So what really is the problem that I'm going to spend most of the rest of this session thinking about? So what makes a meta-analysis conclusive in the sense that we can draw reliable conclusions about the intervention from the meta-analysis? And that's a difficult thing to decide. I'm not going to answer that question really in many ways right now, but we've noticed a few things that we have to be careful about. First, that we need to avoid overconfidence when we make claims about conclusiveness. We shouldn't base conclusive decisions about whether a trial is conclusive just because we've got a p-value of less than 0.05. So that's the first sort of obvious thing. But conversely, we can't use the excuse of avoiding overconfidence to suddenly go the opposite way and be overcautious, because it is important to avoid research waste and avoid people going into trials where there really is no need for it and they should just be getting the treatment, for example. So we shouldn't be updating, we shouldn't be encouraging updates of reviews where the results are genuinely clear and we could draw a sensible conclusion. And the third issue is that we should also try and avoid fence sitting. It's, in some ways Cochrane has perhaps in the past tried to avoid this problem by simply not making any conclusions, just saying here is the evidence. And I think there's a big and perhaps problematic issue in Cochrane is that we tend to fence sit too much. We'll say here is the evidence, you decide. But surely Cochrane reviews are there to inform readers, and they need to be informed about, is this intervention I'm seeing genuinely useful? If I'm seeing a big treatment effect, should I go out and now use it today, or should I not? And we shouldn't just fence sit and make no conclusions. So again, we shouldn't be overconfident, we shouldn't be underconfident, but we have to have some decision and some judgment to be made. So I think for the rest of this session, I'm going to sort of dig down slightly more deeply into the formal methodology around updating a meta-analysis and the impact that it has statistically on our conclusions. So I'm going to start by thinking about what I might call classic meta-analyses, the classic cumulative meta-analysis, where we simply, every time a new publication emerges, a new study emerges, a new trial comes out, we just update a meta-analysis using a conventional random effects meta-analysis, for example, without any sort of clever stats. We just plug it into RevMan or whatever and just do the standard result, just updating. So this forest plot on the right here is a cumulative meta-analysis. So these are not the blocks and bars are not studies, but they're the meta-analyses at each update as we add each new study to the process. So of course the first block is just the first study. The second block is the meta-analysis of the first two studies, not the result of the second study, and so on to the meta-analysis of the first 10 studies, and so on until the diamond is just the meta-analysis once we've got all the studies that we have accumulated at least so far. And so you can see from this sort of the same kind of pattern we were seeing in the examples from Cochrane, that you can see the treatment effect is fairly consistent once we get down past about 10 or so, 10, 15 trials. The treatment effect itself doesn't change very much. If you compare the dotted line through the plot is the treatment effect at the very end, and if you compare that obviously to studies at 10, 11, 12, it's not changing much. But the treatment effect is declining quite fast and changing quite fast from the first 2 or 3, where there's a very big treatment effect in one direction. So let's think a little bit about type 1 error. So here's the sort of the same idea of the forest plot again. Obviously, if we just did a meta-analysis of the first 3 trials, we get this result here, the third one down, and hey, it looks like it works. You've got a big treatment effect, a confidence interval that excludes the null. Hooray, this is an effective treatment. But of course, we only have to add one more trial, and suddenly, in this case, we've got a null treatment effect with a wide confidence interval, and we conclude the treatment doesn't work. It's completely, in fact, no different to the control or the placebo, whatever the control arm is in this meta-analysis. In fact, this is a very rare and unusual case where, in fact, if we add enough trials, we'll ultimately get a statistically significant result in the opposite direction. So we might conclude around here that actually what we've got is a drug that's a failure, that's actually clearly harmful. But actually at the last point, we're back to a situation where the confidence interval crosses the null, and perhaps our final conclusion, had we just waited till all the trials available were, this is perhaps a treatment with no effect really, perhaps mildly in the harm direction, but we're not conclusive on that. So you can see as we update, we might have 4 very different conclusions or 4 different opinions, depending on where we were in the update process in this meta-analysis. And so we have to be careful about this type 1 error, about jumping to saying something is statistically meaningful, is a meaningful conclusive result, when in fact it really isn't. Obviously the converse of that is type 2 error, and let's illustrate this with different meta-analysis. So we might get through the first 5 or 6 studies, and we get to this point with a treatment effect not far from the null and a wide confidence interval, and hey, this doesn't look like a very impressive treatment. Should we stop updating now? Is this really ever going to have a benefit? And so we'd add a few more trials, and it's still not looking very good. The treatment effect's a bit bigger now, but still the confidence interval is very wide. Add another 10 trials or so, and nothing has really changed. The treatment effect is still much as it was. We've still not excluded the null. The confidence interval is still a bit wide. Surely we should give up now. But of course, inevitably, if we update any meta-analysis for long enough and add enough evidence, our confidence interval will shrink until we get a statistically significant result, as in fact we do by the final trial here. So perhaps this might be a conclusion that there's a very modest but genuine treatment effect, might be the best conclusion for this meta-analysis. So that's the type 2 error. That's sort of, we need to avoid errors where we're saying, oh, this treatment doesn't work, we can stop updating, when in fact it is beneficial. So how have we tried to handle these issues in statistics and meta-analysis in the past? Well, about 10, 15 years ago, various authors were thinking that this idea of gradually updating meta-analysis had a lot in common with sequential trial design, sequential clinical trials. And then the idea is that in a sequential clinical trial, we do multiple analyses through the time period, through the course of the trial, and if at any of those sort of interim updates through the trial, the effect is clearly very large, then we stop the trial. Or conversely, if it looks like the treatment really isn't working, we can also stop the trial. So if we've got a really big effect or clearly a really useless effect, we would stop the clinical trial early. We wouldn't waste patients, potentially harm patients by continuing to randomize a trial which had already reached a conclusion. But obviously we have to be careful for the same reasons in there. We have to avoid, a type 1 error of saying this treatment is conclusive before it really is. And we need to avoid type 2 errors of, saying a treatment doesn't work when if we just randomized a few more patients, we would have shown it did. So clinical trials had a lot of structures and methodology around how to do this. And what you do in a clinical trial formally is you select your type 1 error, normally 5%, the classic 5% level, and your type 2 error, or equivalent of your statistical power, so a power of, say, 90%, or a type 2 error of 10%. And you have to specify a clinical effect, which is, perhaps a minimally important clinical difference. And then you perform those interim analyses through the trial. And of course, meta-analysts realize that we can replace trial here by review and meta-analysis. The idea, of course, is we want to stop updating a review as soon as we have a genuinely conclusive result. So why not use the same methodology as sequential trials, but instead of having interim analyses through a trial, we just have meta-analyses over time. So that led to various different potential methods for controlling type 1 and type 2 error in meta-analyses. There are two broad methods that control both type 1 and type 2 error. One is called sequential meta-analysis, and the other is called trial sequential analysis, and I'll look at those two in a bit more detail. There are a few methods that only control the type 1 error, i.e. the p-value problem. That's the law of the iterated logarithm, a method developed by Schuster and Pocock that hasn't really had a name, so I'll just call it the Schuster-Pocock method. And a very recent method which uses a new variant of p-values called e-values, and it's known as all-in meta-analysis. I won't look at the law of the iterated logarithm or the Schuster-Pocock method because research that I have done in the past for Cochrane has shown that they don't actually work very well. They're not particularly good at controlling type 1 error. They're not particularly helpful in meta-analysis. And I won't look at the e-value all-in approach, as that's really too new. That has only come out this year, so it hasn't yet had robust assessment of its value. But I just point out that it does exist and it may be more useful in the future. And there are also other methods that aren't formally controlling for error but might be useful. We might go to a fully Bayesian analysis. For example, we might have a Bayesian analysis with a very skeptical prior where we think the treatment doesn't work, and we'll only accept that the treatment works if our evidence can beat that skeptical prior and lead to a favourable posterior distribution. We can also look at issues around how robust or stable an analysis might be to future studies. So we might look at what happens if we just added a new study. How much would the results change if a new study was added, say a new study with a null effect was added, for example, to the meta-analysis. Or we can look at how power would change. So, would adding a new study substantially improve the power of the meta-analysis to detect an effect? And if it would, that would be a good grounds for continuing to update the review. But those methods are a little bit less formal and less precise, so I'm not going to consider them here either. So let's start with sequential meta-analysis. This was developed back in about 2010. You should notice that my name is on the list of authors for this method, so be aware of my personal bias in this talk about this method. The sequential meta-analysis method uses score and information statistics, Z and V, rather than treatment effect and standard error to assess value. But in a meta-analysis, that's fortunately not very complicated, because if we're using a standard meta-analysis with standard inverse variance weights W, then the score statistic is simply the sum of the weights times the treatment effect estimates from each trial, the W times the YI, and the information is just the sum of the weights. So in a sort of a classic meta-analysis, of course, the treatment effect estimate is the effect estimate times the weight over the sum of the weights. So in fact, the Z is just the numerator from our treatment effect estimator, and the V is just the denominator. So as for a sequential clinical trial, we have to specify what our type 1 error is going to be, and that's usually 5%. We have to specify a minimally important estimate of interest, how big a treatment effect we're looking for. And we have to specify either the power or conversely the type 2 error. So a 10% type 2 error is the same as a 90% power for the meta-analysis. And we simply calculate Z and V at each update. And once we've crossed a pre-specified ZV boundary that corresponds to the type 1 and type 2 error and effect estimate, then we can say that we've got a conclusive result. What is slightly different about the sequential meta-analysis method is that it can incorporate uncertainty and the heterogeneity into its analysis. And we've done this by essentially what you do sort of a semi-Bayesian approach, where we put a prior estimate on heterogeneity, usually assuming that the heterogeneity is high, or with a high heterogeneity or a high I-squared. And essentially we combine that prior heterogeneity estimate with the Day-Simonian estimate of heterogeneity at the current update, and we just use a classic Bayesian estimate to create a sort of posterior heterogeneity at each update, and we use that instead of the standard Day-Simonian layered estimate. And so what we're doing essentially is we're using a slightly inflated heterogeneity estimate, which will gradually sort of converge to the Day-Simonian layered estimate over time. So we avoid problems of misestimating heterogeneity in the meta-analysis. So we're going to illustrate this with another cumulative example. Here's another meta-analysis where you can see that the treatment effect, after about 4 studies, we get a significant result for the first time. But a few studies later, in the second red bar, we get a meta-analysis where it's not quite significant anymore. We're just shifting the confidence interval over the null again. So perhaps we're saying, although we've hit a significant result, we're maybe not completely confident that we've got a conclusive result yet. But by about study 10, the second green bar there, we can see the treatment effect is getting more stable, and all the updates after that have confidence intervals that exclude the null. So perhaps by that point we're reaching a situation where we could have stopped the meta-analysis, and we really didn't need those last 10 trials or so. So what does applying sequential meta-analysis to this system do for us? Well, here is what a sequential meta-analysis looks like visually. So the boundary for Z and V are the black lines, and you can see it's just simply a rectangle that we take. So if we go above a certain Z score and enter the green area, that means that we found evidence in favour of the treatment. If we gather enough statistical information that we end up in the blue area, we conclude that we haven't reached the desired treatment effect size. And obviously there's also a region at the bottom I haven't highlighted where if we cross the lower boundary, we conclude that in fact we'd have evidence for harm of the treatment. So in this case I've illustrated the process of the sequential analysis. Each meta-analysis is one of the dots on the plot, and so the line is the path of the meta-analysis over time. So starting at the third trial, at the first proper meta-analysis, we can see that we haven't crossed the boundary at study 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. By study 9, we're quite close to the upper boundary, we haven't crossed it. And at study 10, we cross the boundary into the green area, so we conclude the treatment effect works. The treatment works. And that pretty much matches what we've seen here. You can see that that's sort of pretty much the same here. We're stopping at about the same point as that second green bar. And that's the point at which we sort of say the meta-analysis has really become conclusive. The other method, trial sequential analysis, was developed by a group in Copenhagen in about 2008. Again, you have to specify the type 1 error, type 2 error, and the desired effect estimate for your meta-analysis. But this works on the approach of you sort of treat the meta-analysis as if it were a single trial, and you have to calculate the sample size for that whole trial. Obviously that requires estimates of things like control group risk or control group standard deviation, and it does mean that you have to adjust the sample size for heterogeneity. So you have to slightly adjust the sample size repeatedly over time, or you have to pre-specify an estimate of heterogeneity to calculate the sample size. So it's a little bit more complicated than sequential meta-analysis, and there has to be some adjustment over time for heterogeneity. It uses the O'Brien and Fleming alpha spending boundaries as the boundaries for crossing. Don't worry if you don't know what those are. Essentially, they are the boundaries that control that you are controlling type 1 and type 1 error properly through your meta-analysis. And we stop when we either cross the alpha spending boundary or we have reached the required sample size. And so sort of similarly, here's the same meta-analysis, but now with for trial sequential analysis. So the curved black lines are the alpha spending boundaries, and the vertical line just under 600 patients is the maximum sample size. And you can see here, so we go through trial 3, 4, 5, and at trial 6 we almost cross the boundary. Trial 7 and 8 drop back in a bit. Trial 9 to trial 10 is where we quite clearly have crossed the boundary and exceeded the sample size required as well. So again, we're stopping at around about trial 9 or 10. So fairly similar to sequential meta-analysis, but we do have a conclusive evidence in favour of the treatment here. So to illustrate this in more detail, I've taken that 469 Cochrane meta-analyses that I've used earlier, and I've applied conventional or naive or standard cumulative meta-analysis to each of them. I've applied trial sequential analysis using heterogeneity adjustment, and I've applied the sequential meta-analysis either with ignoring the heterogeneity adjustment or with a prior heterogeneity of either 50% I-squared or 90% I-squared. So all methods are applied here, including heterogeneity adjustment for sequential meta-analysis. Well, what do we get? Here are basically the results for applying it to those 469 meta-analyses. The green area indicates for the sequential methods where we cross a boundary in favour of the treatment. So the red area indicates where we haven't crossed the boundary. We're still within the boundary. We haven't reached any conclusion yet. The blue area, the slightly small blue areas on the left, are where we've crossed the area for no effect, i.e. we've reached the maximal information or the maximum sample size, but we haven't reached the desired treatment effect. So for standard meta-analysis, the green means that we've got a conventional significant result at P at the 0.055% level. Red means that we haven't got a significant meta-analysis, so P is above 0.05. You'll notice first, I think, that the no effect bits, the reaching the maximal sample size, is very rare in meta-analysis. Only a few % of meta-analyses ever achieve that. Largely because, as other authors have shown, meta-analyses in Cochrane are underpowered to detect their actual effect. Most meta-analyses don't have enough studies, enough patients to actually detect the effect that is really there, because generally speaking, trials wildly overinflate the effect that actually exists and do power calculations based on wildly overinflated treatment effects. And so when you look at reality, most trials and most meta-analyses are actually underpowered. We can see that, standard meta-analysis produces a favourable or significant result somewhat more often than the sequential methods, slightly over 50%. And we see that jumps back to where we said, there were 12% of meta-analyses that produced a false significance, an early significance that was wrong. And so that's sort of a chunk of those. So that's that chunk where, we're producing a false significance. And sort of the trial sequential methods, the sequential meta-analysis methods are broadly controlling for that. Only about a third of meta-analyses with them come out as favourable with a genuinely conclusive result. You can see that the heterogeneity adjustment with sequential meta-analysis, a 50% I-squared actually doesn't make much difference really. It's, that hardly makes a difference just ignoring heterogeneity altogether. 90% I-squared at the start does substantially decrease the number of analyses that we think are conclusive. Perhaps it decreases them a bit too much to under 25%. Let's just look at that. Let's break that down by ultimate significance, so statistical significance at the final update. So on the left, we can see again that green bar for the standard meta-analysis level is those 13% or so, 12%, 30% of meta-analyses that produced a significant result at some update, but were not ultimately significant. You can see that by comparison, the trial sequential analysis and the sequential meta-analysis control for that. They have, the number of meta-analysis where, they produce across a boundary, even when ultimately we've got a not significant result later on, is much smaller and is comfortably at around about the proper 5% level. If we compare that to the meta-analyses that are significant at their final update, you can see that actually sequential methods, about a quarter of those are not convincing, according to trial sequential analysis or sequential meta-analysis. So, even of those that have reached a significant result at their most recent update, at least some of those we should be cautious about. They may not genuinely be true statistically significant evidence. So, even some of those might be false positives. So we can see here that, trial sequential analysis will be more cautious about drawing conclusions in Cochrane reviews. If we break that down a bit further, now looking at across the top there is a number of trials in each meta-analysis, and again by the statistical significance status, you can see that part of the problem is that the more studies you have, the more likely you are that a conventional meta-analysis will trigger a statistically significant result. Obviously, the more analyses you do, the more chance you have of getting a significant result somewhere along the way. And you can see the green bar at the very top there increases quite rapidly. Interestingly, if you've got 10 or fewer studies, which of course is the norm in Cochrane reviews, the chance of having a false positive is pretty small. It's only just over 5%. So, arguably in most Cochrane reviews, where we're not going to have many updates because you just haven't had many trials, the risk of this kind of false positive isn't actually that high. Comparatively, if we look at the bottom, you can see that, there's an issue where standard meta-analysis produces a significant result with not very many trials, with less than 10 trials, then sequential methods are much less confident and that's genuine. You can see that only about less than 2/3, if you look at the bottom left corner, less than 2/3 of the meta-analyses with under 10 studies, but a significant result from those 10 studies are convincing according to the sequential approaches. But as you add more trials, obviously things start to converge and they're more similar as you add more studies in. If we compare that now to the heterogeneity, the I-squared, so now we've got across from left to right, we've got I-squared estimates at 0 to 25%, and so on. Just really to point out here, mostly at the top here, you can see that higher heterogeneity tends to lead to more of these false positive results in a conventional meta-analysis. So if the I-squared is large, we're going to tend to see more false positives. For lower heterogeneity meta-analyses, it's really not a problem, as you can see in the top left. And the same sort of apply, interesting, it's slightly less convincing with the ultimately significant results, but still we've got this issue that heterogeneity, we are going to disagree between standard meta-analysis and sequential meta-analysis. So the next question you might sort of ask is, okay, so we might use sequential analysis to avoid these type 1 errors and this sort of false conclusions, but are we just going to, is that taking how many extra trials, are we sort of wasting evidence by doing that? Are we requiring more trials to do it? Interestingly, we're not. These are histograms of how many trials we need before a sequential method crosses the boundary compared to how many trials it took for a conventional meta-analysis to reach significance. And so generally speaking, you can see that normally, if we're hitting statistical significance, the most common result is that, there are no more trials required. So a sequential method crosses the boundary at the same point as our first significant meta-analysis. Occasionally you need an extra 1 or 2 trials with trial sequential analysis, for example, in the bottom there. But generally speaking, you don't need much more evidence to cross a boundary if you've got a genuinely meaningful result. The exception there is in the top left with the 90% I-squared prior version of sequential meta-analysis, where sometimes you do need quite a lot more evidence. And as we saw, that's partly because it's much more conservative, because we're assuming a much higher heterogeneity. So just to sort of summarize what we've seen here, conventional cumulative meta-analysis, if we just do a conventional decimal-led meta-analysis at each update, then we definitely have some degree of elevated type 1 error going up from, it goes up from the classic 5% where it should be to, at least sort of 10, 12%. And if you've got a lot of studies, it rises a lot more. However, a problem is a slight error. It's mostly an issue for trials with, where there are this false positive, that results, that few should say more, really. If you've got lots of studies, that's where the problem is. If you've got high heterogeneity, that's where the problem is. Which of course we don't generally speaking have, because most meta-analyses don't have very many studies in them in Cochrane. If we look at the sequential methods, yes, they control type 1 and type 2 error, but they're not doing so perfectly when there's a lot of heterogeneity. So even they're struggling a bit with high heterogeneity. And of course they're a bit difficult to run. You need special software. They don't work in Revman, obviously. You've got to do slightly awkward things like decide what a desired treatment effect is, which requires some discussion with clinicians. You've got issues of having to calculate sample sizes. The whole concept of what information is a bit unintuitive, so they're a bit difficult to interpret and conduct. And I think to note the Bayesian heterogeneity approach in sequential meta-analysis is probably a bit too conservative and is really not needed in practice. So, do we need sequential methods at all? Well, I think as a discussion on this is carried on over the years, I think the conclusion is that generally speaking, most Cochrane reviews, it's not really a problem, mainly because we just don't have enough updates. We don't have enough trials. If we're only ever doing a couple of updates with 10 trials or less, the chance of, false positives, false statistical significance is fairly low. So it's not a massive problem, this type 1 error, really. And of course we expect, we are expecting and intending to update results, or we are expecting to add studies as they emerge. Statistical significance and, the meta-analysis is not the only reason for updating reviews, of course. So we expect the conclusions to change over time, and that's just natural. That's what we sort of expect to happen. And I say most Cochrane reviews that we're not updating at every single trial. We're not like a sequential trial. We're doing lots and lots of analyses over time. We're generally not updating every trial. Most Cochrane reviews will only have a couple of updates every couple of years, and they don't have a formal planned update schedule, so the value of sequential methods is less clear. Particularly as, of course, sequential methods were designed for clinical trials where they were going to be used prospectively within a definite trial protocol. If we're using these designs retrospectively after the trials have been published and completed, just when we update, it's less clear that the statistics are truly valid for that, particularly given the heterogeneity. And, they aren't, dealing with heterogeneity is problematic, and, the way the methods deal with heterogeneity is slightly ad hoc. And as I say, perhaps they're just a bit too complicated. They're a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut in some ways. They're quite complicated methods that aren't improving things very much. The other criticism that's sort of come up is that, is it taking us back to the bad old days of statistical significance? We're now hopefully we've started to get away from this idea that, my meta-analysis has a p-value of less than 0.05, therefore the treatment works. And this kind of hard statistical significance at the 5% level is hopefully disappearing as it should. And, the idea of going back to just now having crossing a boundary being the indication for significance isn't really improving things. It's still an artificial sort of boundary condition. And that, the advice is, of course, that Cochrane reviews should be interpreted in terms of confidence intervals and estimated effects, and sort of the whole vision, the effect, the confidence interval, the heterogeneity, and so on across all the outcomes. And we shouldn't be using a single binary conclusion to determine significance. So we shouldn't be using our sequential meta-analysis across the boundary in just the same way as we shouldn't be using our meta-analysis as a p-value of less than 0.05. There's a sort of sense that Cochrane reviews should just present the evidence that exists to date, that they're not here to draw conclusions. I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And of course, systematic reviews are generally not just a single decision. We're normally dealing with multiple outcomes in Cochrane reviews, multiple subgroups for each outcome. We've got to think about the heterogeneity both within groups and across groups. So we're not making a single decision based on a single meta-analysis in Cochrane reviews generally. So the Cochrane Scientific Committee a few years ago sort of discussed this based on research that I and others conducted on these methods, and they reached various conclusions. These can all be read on the Cochrane website, but I'll just summarize them here a little bit. So the idea here is that, decision makers should not be influenced by previous meta-analyses or plans for future updates. That seems a little odd to me, I have to admit, because, surely you want to think about, is this meta-analysis going to be updated? When is the update going to happen? It seems a little bit odd to say that we shouldn't even think about whether this meta-analysis will be updated. So I'm not totally sure I agree with that, but there is a point here that, the current evidence is the current evidence, and should we be adjusting statistically for meta-analyses that may or may not, updates that may or may not ever happen. Obviously they say that, Cochrane reviews should be based on effect size and confidence intervals, not just null hypotheses, as I've just mentioned before. And, binary significant, non-significant is not an appropriate way to go, as I think we all agree. As we've noticed, retrospective approaches to meta-analyses is not really appropriate. We're not convinced that, this retrospective use of sequential methods is appropriate, given that they're designed for prospective sequential trials, really. And meta-analysis is not just a single decision. And sequential methods have problems with heterogeneity. This interesting one about Cochrane reviews may recommend a meta-analysis is no longer updated when the result is convincing for benefit and when neither future data nor further changes in clinical practice are likely to change the conclusions. That's an interesting one, because to me that advocates quite strongly for sequential methods. How are we supposed to tell that a result is convincing if we don't have some formal statistical way of judging what convincing is? And I think this is probably a big problem and an unresolved problem in Cochrane, is that we're very fuzzy about what constitutes convincing or conclusive results. And that's probably something we need to think about in more detail. And again, how do we know that, updates are not going to change the conclusions if we don't have the formal sequential style analysis to show that, we've crossed a boundary? It's quite unlikely that we will change in the future. So, sequential methods are designed to help exactly that position. So I have to admit, I don't quite understand that claim. But I think the bottom one is very valid, that what we really should be doing is avoiding drawing conclusions on small amounts of evidence. Most Cochrane reviews just don't really have that much evidence in them, and we just need to be cautious about, drawing conclusions that are unreasonable given the small evidence base. So my main criticism of this kind of approach is that, the classic Cochrane claim of what we should be doing is focusing on treatment effect estimation and confidence intervals and just saying what the evidence is, isn't very helpful to actual decision makers. Because a decision maker wants to know, should I be using this treatment right now, or should I wait for the next update? And if there is, and is there going to be an update, and when is that update going to happen? So, if we're not, as Cochrane, helping people with those things, what good are Cochrane reviews? I think if we're not saying, this evidence is clearly favourable to the treatment, or we're saying, this evidence needs an update, it will appear next year, are we really helping anybody? And sequential methods can help with that decision-making process. They don't have to be a binary conclusion, we've crossed a boundary now, we should stop updating. But they can inform us if, we have crossed a boundary, at least this meta-analysis in this review is now pretty conclusive. You could use the treatment based on that evidence. Or, we have not crossed a boundary yet, but we're quite close to the boundary. Maybe the next big trial will help us, reach a conclusion. And sequential methods can be used in that more informal, sort of more holistic approach without having to be strict binary methods. And perhaps really what we need is just, as this, in some ways this talk today is for, is better education about the issues. That we need to understand about the issue of quality of trials, early heterogeneity, early uncertainty, particularly when we don't have much evidence, we have few trials, small trials, and so on. So sequential methods are still accepted in Cochrane for formal prospective reviews, where new studies are actually being planned as part of the review and meta-analysis process, where that's kind of formally prospective. That leaves a bit of a wiggle room about what happens sort of informally prospective, where, a reader might want to design a trial based on the findings of a Cochrane review. Should we have sequential analysis to support that? And also, there's still sort of inaction for living systematic reviews. That's a new area where a living review is done with very fast updates, often automated updates, designed, we update perhaps every month or every 2 months, perhaps with automated updates, automated meta-analyses. And of course there we need much more care to decide, when we should be reporting the results, when evidence has really changed. So to sort of summarise overall, it is probably fair to say that the effect estimate we have at any time and the confidence interval we have at any time, with some caution, are valid at that time. And so artificially correcting the confidence intervals or the effect estimates for updates that may have not happened in the past or may not happen in the future is a bit questionable. Because, the evidence today is the evidence today. But any decision we make based on the evidence we have today may not be robust. Because particularly when we're thinking about should we update the meta-analysis at all, that's where the sequential thinking, what happens with an update, is it robust, has to come in. And of course, reviewers, you as editors, readers of reviews, need to be aware of how things can change over time. People should really be aware, that, a meta-analysis based on 3 studies may well change completely after the next 2. The heterogeneity may change completely. But of course that is just the nature of research. We expect things to be changing over time. So perhaps again more awareness is what's really needed here. So to quote from the musical Avenue Q, to sort of head out, everything in life is only for now. The idea of course here that, things change. We know that medical science advances over time. We know that new trials are going to change the results. We know that where we are now is not where we're going to be next year. I think particularly, having got through the COVID pandemic, we're all well aware that, where we were in 2020 is not where we were in 2021 and is not where we are in 2022. So, things change rapidly. And sequential methods, to some extent, are just a very statistical and perhaps artificial method of dealing with this uncertainty over time. It only is something that's controlling for type 1-2 error, very statistically focused. It's a bit narrow, and as I say, it only addresses the known unknowns of meta-analysis. The statistical uncertainty due to limited evidence. What sequential methods, of course, can't do, and in some ways it's very difficult to do for anything, is handle the unknown unknowns. What happens when a new treatment emerges? What happens if, a new trial identifies some side effects that haven't been spotted before, or a new trial looks at different patient groups and finds, the treatment does or does not work in a certain patient group. Things that, aren't even in the meta-analysis or the review yet. Those are perhaps the big changes that we need to be looking out for, and of course sequential methods can't deal with that. So to finish off, here is my advice, and I stress obviously that this is just my advice as a co-convener and it's not formal recommendations from Cochrane. But the basic principle is we can, broadly speaking, continue as we are. You can continue to use random effects, data in a layered style meta-analysis for updating your systematic reviews. So sequential methods exist and they're optional, but outside of prospective reviews or living reviews, they're perhaps not necessary, and they may need some justification if you're going to include them in the review. The biggest, of course, issue is we have to continue to counsel authors against using statistical significance and p-values in the research. And a reminder, of course, that includes overinterpretation of confidence intervals, not just p-values. So, our confidence interval excludes the null, therefore this treatment works. We have to be cautious about. And we have to be cautious about significance both positively and negatively. We have to be cautious against false significance in saying this treatment works because the confidence interval excludes the null. We also have to be careful about the negative. I frequently rail to authors against silly statements like, the confidence interval included the null, therefore the treatment does not work. Which, of course, as you should be well aware, is not true at all. That the confidence interval includes the null just means we don't have enough evidence yet. So we have to be careful about false interpretation of confidence intervals and p-values in both directions. And we have to be careful about avoiding bold claims of effect or indeed non-effect if we've got very few studies or very small sample sizes or very high heterogeneity. Because we should be aware that treatment effects are going to decline over time, heterogeneity is probably going to decline over time, and particularly if we haven't even done an update yet, obviously we need to be very cautious about any interpretation we make of results. But balancing that again, as I've said, we can't be overcautious, we shouldn't be sitting on the fence either. So I think we should be much more rigorous in insisting that updates are performed, and that we only don't update where we've got the evidence is clearly overwhelming, whether that's from a sequential approach or just clearly this treatment is extremely obviously beneficial, or for interventions where there clearly is just no hope, where the chance of this ever having a meaningful clinical value is very low. I think we might need much stronger clarity, greater clarity about when we think that a review will be updated, and I think importantly to say when it's going to be updated. I think that's a big lack at the moment in Cochrane. Or we need to justify very clearly why we don't think a review needs to be updated. I think at the moment some of the sort of decisions about this review is conclusive can be a bit fuzzy. We need to have much clearer thought about this treatment effect is clearly very large, the evidence is very high, there is low heterogeneity, it's very, this is clearly working. Or conversely, there is no chance of any new evidence changing our conclusions here. And more broadly, of course, that conclusions should be driven by clinical value and not by statistics. Even as a statistician, of course, I cautiously say that it's the clinical value that matters. Are the results clinically meaningful to somebody? Is this a treatment effect that would genuinely change practice? Would you go away and give this drug to somebody today? Is it consistent across the populations, locations, drug doses or whatever? Is the heterogeneity generally low enough to be confident that, we can use this drug safely? And so all those issues are just as important in deciding about updating and how we conclude results from updated reviews. So I will pause there. I will thank you for listening, and I will remind you that there is going to be a sort of a Q&A session, a live Q&A session for this talk. Thank you very much.